Perfect. Thank you. Okay, welcome everyone to our closing keynote of the South Carolina 2021 Archival Association's virtual annual meeting. This is our closing keynote, and our closing keynote will be delivered by Micha Broadnax, who is the project manager of the Black Teacher Archive at Harvard Graduate School of Education. It is my pleasure to introduce and welcome you all into this session. This session will run from 2:30 p.m. until 3:45 p.m. After Micha speaks, we will have just a brief portion for us to deliver our closing remarks on this conference. But what a way to close out this conference, and we are honored to have Micha here. Just a few things before we start this session. I'm going to try to go to our next slide. Can everyone see the screen? Okay, we're good. Okay. So we're going to go to our next slide, and here's just our meeting information. There is no concurrent session happening with this one, but you may enter and leave the session. But we hope you stay. Please keep your camera off and stay muted unless Micha gives you instructions to do so otherwise. There will be, there of course won't be any more 15-minute breaks because we're at the end of the session, but the session will be recorded, and I'm sure you received the recording disclaimer. If you wish to not remain and not be recorded, Zoom will have you leave, but otherwise you have to consent to stay. And then also feel free to leave any questions or comments from Micha in the chat. So now I am going to introduce you to Micha. Micha Broadnax, whose pronouns are she and they, is an archival strategist currently residing on the ancestral land of the Naugatuck people. Micha is the project manager for the Black Teacher Archive at Harvard Graduate School of Education and serves as a community workshop trainer with Documenting the Now. Informed by Black feminist space making, she is passionate about memory, documentation, and knowledge retention in movement, organizing, and legacy making. They also serve as archivist and researcher for legal and policy scholar Anita F. Hill, consultant for the History Project, Boston Queer and Independent Community Archive, and digital project archivist at Mount Holyoke College. So Micha, I turn it over to you. And I'm going to stop the share of my screen so that you can share yours.
All righty, thank you so much for that. So good afternoon, and thank you South Carolina Archival Association for the invitation to be in conversation with you today. It is an honor. I hope my reflections provide insight to our collective vision for how archival labor can contribute to change as we seek to disrupt staid traditional practices, expand the narratives that exist, and ensure that future memory keepers understand the role we play in challenging norms rooted in the historical exclusion of communities of color within the archive. As Tabitha so graciously introduced, I am Micha Broadnax, and my pronouns are she and they, and I serve as the project manager of the Black Teacher Archive, an Andrew W. Mellon Foundation supported initiative, conceived and awarded to Dr. Jarvis Gibbons and Dr. Amani Perry, and supported by the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Before I begin my talk, I would like to acknowledge that we continue to navigate a global pandemic. I invite a moment of silence to recognize people who have transitioned, possibilities that have been limited, and situations that have been drastically impacted by pandemic cautions, considerations, and restrictions. Thank you to those who felt called to engage. I would like to believe that there's still much possible in shared collective grief, and so we must carry on. Thank you so much for having me at this juncture. You know, you all have been in programming all day. I've been able to attend a few sessions. It's been wonderful. As been mentioned, I reside on Indigenous lands ancestrally stewarded by the Naugatuck people, and I welcome us all to become familiar with the history of the spaces where we reside. And it was wonderful to see land acknowledgements at the beginning of this presentation. At the beginning of this conference today. For those who may not know, that means I live in Western Massachusetts, modern day. I know I still have much to learn about how I must be accountable as a non-native person, but I've come to understand that each attempt to acknowledge the land challenges the erasure of the First Nations people. I encourage us to be introspective about how we might ensure that Indigenous self-determination is supported in our words and our deeds. I'd like to extend my profound appreciation to the organizers of the conference and to my personal wranglers, Tabitha Samuel and Aaron Alsop, for their unyielding patience and understanding. Thank you to my dear colleague, Dorothy Berry, Digital Collections Program Manager at Harvard's Houghton Library, for recommending this project be shared in this space today. I'd also like to acknowledge the many contributors, enthusiasts, and collaborators connected to developing the Black Teacher Archive project. And I have a few special ones to name a little bit later in the presentation. Somehow, in the spring and summer of this year, I managed to visit the state of South Carolina intentionally 3 different times, visiting, learning, and occasionally resting at sites such as Myrtle Beach, the Sea Islands, and Charleston. In my time, I experienced historic spaces such as the Penn Center on St. Helena Island, bus tour of Charleston, visited Mother Emanuel AME, and drove over the Combahee River. I owe a trip back, though, to the region to visit Avery Research Center and the Atlantic Beach, also known as Black Pearl, in the Myrtle Beach Museum of the Colored School, something that I recently just learned about. Nonetheless, often on these trips, I reflected on the journey of my ancestors who cultivated resistance strategies to violent repression, and I found more meaning in my work after each experience. Upon receiving my invitation to speak to you all, I was struck by the irony of becoming so intimately involved with the history and legacy of the Palmetto State throughout the pandemic. To be in the position of talking with you all today feels particularly poignant and serendipitous, given these journeys. Lions Archivist. So as a memory worker, I have long aspired to be the Lions Archivist, the West African proverb, until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter, makes clear the need for the multiplicity of narratives and the narrowness of singular perspectives. Lions Archivist, as in the steward or caretaker of the lion story and legacy. Not to speak for the lion, but to do the deeply personal and caring labor of organizing, describing, preserving, and making accessible documents that render the possibility to know the lion more intimately and authentically. Archives have historically done such care work for the hunter, and it's time to review and consider our positionality to the lion and the possibilities for repair and correction. As the description for this year's annual meeting describes, in many ways, the archival world is at a crossroads and finding more effective ways of documenting, preserving, and providing access to the histories of the underrepresented minority groups. This critical juncture before us requires acknowledgement and commitment. A recognition of context is important before repair. The importance of having a tragic sense of history, as Jermaine talked about in his opening keynote. And also mindfulness, as mentioned in last year's talk by Sarah Calise, entitled Dismantling White Supremacy in Archives, as she so thoughtfully, referenced Howard Zinn's keynote to the Society of American Archivists, which called on the archives community to more critically engage and consider the power and decision-making. We have the responsibility to closely examine our praxis and whose stories are kept in the memory of this country or state. So before even thinking about or wanting to talk about, Black teachers and education, right? The contextual important thing is to root it in, the efforts around anti-literacy. Before us is a statute for South Carolina from around 1835, in which it named it a punishable offense to teach Black people to read or write with a penalty upwards of $100 for a white person, or whippings not to exceed 50 lashes, regardless of the enslavement status. So whether you were considered a free Black person or not, to be able to physically cause harm to your body. And within the same statute, I think it's interesting to note the prohibition against schools or any place of instruction for teaching any enslaved person or free person of color. So again, this really intentional effort and this linkage between literacy, education, personhood, and who better to continue to meditate on that idea than Mary McLeod Bethune. For with the denial of literacy, Black people uniquely understood the potential and possibility in being able to read and write. As one South Carolina daughter said, "The whole world opened up to me when I learned to read." Mary McLeod Bethune was born in 1875 near Maysville, South Carolina, on a rice and cotton farm in Sumter County, the 15th of 17 children born to Sam and Patsy McLeod, both former enslaved people. Mary McLeod Bethune, like so many others, believed deeply in the emancipatory and liberatory possibilities of education. Educational spaces were formed in Negro Baptist churches, high school departments of local colleges, and private institutions, including Maysville Mission School, in which Mary McLeod Bethune was an early pupil and later taught. Before us in this image is Mary McLeod at the girls' school that she founded in Daytona, Florida. One of the most significant and long-lasting progressive legacies of Reconstruction was the establishment of public school systems. And that was the case in South Carolina in 1868. Although we know that the state maintained a racially segregated school culture. Mary McLeod Bethune was an educator and advocate who lived a very associated life, a leader in a number of organizations, founding president of the National Council of Negro Women, president of National Association of Colored Women's Club. And also, she later led the Florida State Teachers Association and served as the president of the American Teachers Association, the National Association for Black Educators. It was under her leadership that the National Journal was utilized to communicate and distribute information about the pedagogical practices in upcoming meetings. Understanding the powerful legacy of Bethune and her counterparts is a critical component of how Black teachers transform lives. Which leads us to this notion of what's historically called colored teacher associations, which I was not familiar with before joining this project. So the Black Teacher Archives centers professional organizations historically referred to as colored teacher associations, which formed a robust professional public as early as 1861. These statewide associations formed in Southern states during Reconstruction and in some Northern and Midwestern states during Jim Crow. These Black organizations existed dually as organizations restricted to white educators also organized. In contrast, Black teachers welcomed educators of Black children regardless of race. Colored teacher associations were formed to enhance educational opportunities for Black children and to develop themselves as professionals, political actors, and intellectuals. These organizations were organized at the state, county, and national level. Through annual meetings, workshops based on subjects, committee structures, and creations of official organs, these organizations created structures to develop. By 1970, the United States government and the National Education Association forced these CTAs, or colored teacher associations, to merge with white professional associations, with the wave of desegregation efforts being enforced. Right, and being mindful that we have a long legacy, thinking about Brown versus Board of Education is 1956, and yet still, I can say that I'm the daughter of a woman who integrated her elementary school when she attended around 1962. And so these legacies live with us. They're still very much a part of our knowing, and there's really still many possibilities for us to learn on an intimate level. I really like this image because it is actually from the South Carolina University, and it's showing a organization, the Palmetto State Education Association meeting, and you can see just how many folks were present to hear and organize and to think about how could they better serve themselves, also serve students. For those of us who are a bit more visual, I did want to include this, image of the United States to kind of highlight and indicate where these associations existed. During this project, I've gotten more intimate with a bit of, geographics of the United States, and so that's improved. But I think it's also important to see the close resemblance, give or take a few states, that this mapping also renders, former Confederate states as well as current states with historically Black colleges and universities. But the states that you see all before you are ones in which, these Black educator organizations existed and thrive. The number of years varies for each of them, depending oftentimes from geographic location and, what was going on locally. But when we're thinking about this project, these are the kind of states that we're trying to center and find more information about. So the whole, goal of the project is to partner with institutions and create a hosted repository of non-exclusive reproductions of CTA journals and publications. The Black Teacher Archive tends to be an online portal for centralizing and preserving the legacy of Black educators before 1970. We'd like to provide researchers and educators with the tools to begin to close the persistent gap in understanding the political and intellectual contributions of African-American school teachers. Right? There might be this mythology, or we might think that, oh, they're non-political people. They just, were complicit in white supremacist, ideological teachings. And in fact, we know that Black educators were one of the stable forces in the community. I really thought it was interesting reading more about Jermaine and learning about him. And, he mentions going by the professor, which was certainly a sign of respect when we're thinking about these colored teacher associations. Not necessarily every teacher, went to a normal school or college, but as a sign of respect and endearment, students would all call their teachers professor. And so in likeness and thinking about these strategies in practice, I would like to also mention, Dr. Jarvis Given's recently published book, Fugitive Pedagogy, in which he talks about this Black educator tradition and the instructional strategies towards the Black freedom movement, the ways in which Black teachers might have operated or, been surveilled by the state, but still were instructing students on best practices, on learning and, self-esteem and appreciation for their Black being and the possibilities that they still had, even though they were surrounded by what seemed like so much limitation. For the Black Teacher Archive, we tend to collaborate with various stewards and stakeholders, and we'll locate these publications of colored teacher associations and coordinate digitization efforts and make them available through a centralized web-based digital archive. State affiliates began publishing journals around 1920s and concluded at the start of the mergers toward the 1970s. This initiative is a non-custodial project in that the organizers of the project did not seek to own the physical copies of the journal. Instead, in archival disruption, it intends to create what we professionally consider an artificial collection, yet honors the network in which the records were created. Right, as archivists or information professionals, we often center provenance. How did the material come in? Who was it owned by? And maintaining that order. And while it gives good insight to the life of the document as it lived with the person in which the document enters the archive, there is larger conversations in which the document also could be participating in. So through culling all this information together into a centralized repository, we're hoping that trends can be seen from the journals and can be viewed like never before. Being able to cross-search, thinking about key topics or things of interest, such as like public health, thinking about, what were the ideas around sex education or prison, what was the community response versus Brown versus Board education? How are they thinking about salary? What kind of pedagogy were they spreading in those spaces? And so at this moment, the archival library repositories across the nation has a number of Colored Teacher Association journals. We've located them in manuscript collections, rare books, and general library collections. And as much as this digitization project is a project about, digital humanities, digitization, centralizing in one place, it's also a project around Black print culture. These journals arrived as part of personal papers, organizational collections, and on occasion as part of library subscriptions. Towards the end of the 1970s, about a decade or two after the mergers, the National Education Association, with assistance with members who are also a part of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, organized a critical intervention to preserve the history and contributions of colored teacher associations through the publishing of state histories. In reviewing these state histories, written just a decade or two after the merging of these segregated organizations, remember, we're already expressing concerns about the significant gaps in preservation and accessibility. The Black Teacher Archive is a recovery and community project to preserve and share the legacy of Black educators. And thus far, we have located journals and we have reviewed journals in over 250 repository holdings. We've contacted over 100 repositories. And in this last year, we've really worked on trying to establish workflows. So thinking about what are the workflows for digitization, whether those are happening, at Harvard's campus, we offer the ability to loan material, whether that's happening on our collaborators campus. Maybe we've also looked into, using local vendors in which are trusted resources. And we've even partnered with local digital public library hubs to think about digitization possibilities. We've also done a lot of work around quality control, thinking about this project is ambitiously accepting, files from across the nation with many different repositories having different practices on how they might name files, shoot files. We've created what would be our ideal specifications. And also we know the importance of being nimble and being open to, accepting what we receive. And right now we've been working steadily around creating catalog records for the digital reproductions that we have come through. But nonetheless, there's more work that has continued to be done as we think about file naming and creating the access copy derivatives, and continue to work with partners to communicate and establish possibilities. We're actually now considering this time harvest season as we celebrate receiving nearly 10,000 high resolution files from over 22 repositories across the nation, some as far west as Oregon. And at this point, we're excited to say that we have about 10 organizations that are currently digitizing or requests are in the queue. So it's a huge undertaking. The Black Teacher Archive is just a 2-year grant. This first year, we established these workflows and developed relationships with partners. And then the next year, we're thinking a lot about access to the material. Priorities including engaging communities such as librarians and archivists that have assisted to the project thus far, but also bringing in scholars with subject expertise or interest and current educators to help develop possibilities for interacting with this information. We're also thinking about supplemental content such as timelines, state association histories, topic guides, and other content to better understand the context of the material. So as we devoted heavily on thinking about what is, our communication infrastructure of receiving the files and the machine behind that, now we're starting to think about what does the front-facing possibilities for this project look like? What kind of conversations do we need to be in? Where do we need to be in community? And so we're looking forward to that developing more and taking a more, forward-facing presence in community with folks as those things are developing. But I'll be remiss if I didn't also censor today the Palmetto Education Association. So as there was a national Black educational organization, the state levels had them, as we talked about a moment ago. South Carolina Black Teachers Organization's last formal name was the Palmetto Education Association, and it officially existed from 1900 to 1967. Growing out of summer teacher institutes to introduce methods and ideas, commitment to professional improvement, with earliest dating back to 1880, these organizations started to informally meet. From 1900 to 1918, the South Carolina State Teachers Association held annual meetings at the South Carolina State University in Orangeburg. And towards the end of that time, around 1918, it started to develop a constitution and determined that actually, if we're going to serve the whole state, we probably should move around a bit. And so, and also in 1918, continuing to think about ways to improve and organize and develop, they changed their name to the Palmetto State Teachers Association to distinguish it from the South Carolina Education Association that had a racial restriction to only white teachers and educators in the state of South Carolina. In 1920, the organization published their first bulletin. In 1923, that bulletin began to include a teacher's directory to publicize members and geographics of active counties. At its peak, 40 out of the 46 counties had between 75 to generally typically almost 100% of Black educators in the state represented. And towards the end of the association had nearly 8,500 members. So when we think about the possibility for this project, There's also, the genealogical possibilities with digitizing such a large amount of information, and the possibilities for folks to look through and see, someone that they're related to, or make this connection of what might their organizing or their politics be, or how might they have been informed by being a member of these associations. And then as we're thinking about the other digital possibilities, such as the geographic information system mapping, right? The GIS, taking these locations in these counties and kind of comparing, what is happening in this space and what's the percentage of folks who are in the organization, and how might that impact the education levels, where are the actual HBCUs in the spaces, and what other kind of possibilities or inferences might one be able to make with this information being more widely accessible. From 1946 to 1951, Palmetto State Teachers Association created a newsletter, a tabloid newspaper format, which had a wider circulation and was published quarterly. And in 1951, the journal was published, and this became on a bi-monthly basis. And in 1953, the journal became the Palmetto Education Association, as the name changed just one more time until it was discontinued in 1967. And as we're thinking about this important history, I must name, the importance of historically Black colleges and universities with their teacher programs, such as South Carolina State University, Claflin University, Morris College, Benedict College, Allen University, Clinton College. They were all active, instrumental to the organizing and developing of teachers. And then you had also spaces and institutions such as Voorhees College, and former institutions such as Friendship College, Brainerd Institute, Harbinson Agricultural College, which were very important in providing a strong supporting base as they held institutional memberships to support the organization. The Palmetto Education Association improved certification and teacher training as they advocated for better facilities, resource allocation, and equitable teacher salaries. Through digitizing this history, it can better complement related archival objects, such as a number of collections across South Carolina have around oral histories and photographs regarding Black education. Continued preservation for these club teacher associations is so important. Otherwise, the story may be told by state superintendent reports, which may provide some insight, but not the authenticity of the organizers of Black educators themselves. This work of the Black Teacher Archive requires partnership with institutions and individuals who have preserved and cherished historic materials produced by African Americans. As a grant-funded laborer, collaboration across Harvard to understand communities of practice, considerations for sustainability, and to make use of the library infrastructure for longevity of projects have been really important collaborations. And also, I'm very thankful to South Carolina University and thinking about the Palmetto Education Association and the South Carolina Education Association, respectively, collection that is within their holdings. It contains the manuscripts and documents relating to PA during the last 2 decades in existence during the 1950s and 60s. And the collection has over 100 issues of journals and bulletins with the provenance of possession by Walker E. Solomon, who served as executive secretary and editor. Thanks to the coordinating efforts of Graham Duncan, who's also serving as the SCAA treasurer, and Edward Blessing, and the student worker Miriam Hoyt, who are responsible for creating and cropping the digital reproductions that will be able to be viewed on this digital repository. The project team has reached out to state HBCUs, given the importance of these institutions in developing individuals who led these Black educated organizations, and the connections are clear. And the leaders of the organizations, the faculty, the principals, and the presidents, and the relationship and the importance of this story. I am hopeful that publications between 1920 and 1950 will be located. The intention of digitization is to render this material more accessible and to centralize information across distributed repositories. With these publications in one space, the network, approach, and concerns of Black educators will be more widely available. Possibilities for text mining, data visualization, network analysis will be more easily possible as this corpus of digitized material can be examined as data. I'm also hopeful we as a profession can continue to make more visible the labor and care applied to the process of digitization. And preparing the material from for scanning or photographing to cropping, to preserving, to describing, the human intervention of care cannot be overstated. I am immensely grateful to all partners for their endeavoring to apply such care to these invaluable collections. And I have a few closing remarks on current project considerations I would like to share, mainly because you all are my people and may be able to appreciate the informational, professional, nerding possibilities as it relates to this project. With colleagues, I have been in conversation about the troubling of the copyright designation of the material as orphan work, especially given the intentionality and perhaps hopes of these Black educators upon merging. The lineage of Black educatorship organizations is a part of a Black freedom tradition, and the word orphan connotates neglect and absence. I believe there's much to further do in thinking through this, but it is a reminder nonetheless sometimes the inadequacy of words or the need for nuanced language that has a sensitivity to textured context. As colleagues in archiving the Black web problematize the use of the word capture as a process preserving the data of web pages, the same language of capture persists in communicating about digitization specifications. I acknowledge the need for improved language to describe this process. As a serial publication, this collection has been fruitful to be in conversation with catalogers on the team. To see the creating bodies change along with the publications, the variances in frequency, and accounting for that in a community of practice has been interesting to consider the impact that this has on the library and archival records, right? Imagining that these get, cataloged into a record as these separate journals, even though they might be, an extension of a title, and how this has highlighted the practice and approach of information professionals, but, looking towards or thinking about researchers and how they might complicate or think that that's confusing or not necessary. And so it gives us opportunity to continue to be in conversation and think about ways that we honor, the multiple traditions and ways in which we find information and seek information to create a textual body that is more accessible. Another area that I think is interesting about the project is thinking about the metadata fields for this item level description, right? Serials are often described at the collection level or the serial level at the top, but in thinking about working with, over 100 repositories for a state like Palmetto or South Carolina, we're hoping that we'll have contributions from 3 to 4 different institutions to kind of piece together a full collection demonstrating the publishing of this organization. So it's important that we think about item level description. And not only as we think about item level description, thinking about what kind of fields would make that more accessible. So thinking about the idea of the physical location, it might also be different from the digitizer and wanting to also name that as a metadata field. So even if it's the same institution or it's a different institution, wanting to name that digital labor actually made this possible. And it's not just about where the collection lives physically, but we also want to talk about the process of how it even was rendered available online. Another area of interest in thinking about metadata is also including information about the provenance of these journals, the idea that some of them were a part of the library collection, and that might be important for a researcher who's interested in print culture and how information is disseminated, or that it's a part of a person's papers. So being able to point to not only the geographic or the physical space in which the journals live, but thinking through what is the relationship of this journal to the other bodies of information in which the material is housed. By making these journals broadly available, we will support scholars, educators, and students' efforts to uncover the genius, strategy, and networks of Black educators of the past. This project demonstrates Black educators as resistors to white supremacy and Black inferiority. This archive has the potential to fundamentally contribute to the fields of African American studies, gender studies, the history of education, teaching and learning, as well as new developments in digital humanities. I thank you for the opportunity to share a bit about the project, and I welcome if you have actually any questions. And with that, I'd like to conclude.
Thank you, Micah, for sharing your project. This is a fascinating project and one that will be highly collaborative. So I think this will be wonderful, and I can only imagine all of the research that will come out of it. So I have placed in the chat for anyone who would like to ask a question or leave a comment for Micah. You may feel free to leave it within the chat. So what do you foresee, I guess, as challenges ahead in developing this project, particularly when it comes to collaborating with institutions?
Yes. Well, I think context is really important. So, before we even started reaching out to people, we wanted to acknowledge among the team just the different factors that are at play, right? It's wonderful to be led by two Black scholars who have used these materials to publish literature scholarship. And it's also important to think about the positionality, right? The idea that we are seeking to recover and work closely with anyone who has this material, but noticing or acknowledging the unique histories of HBCUs as it relates to this material. And so taking in note or acknowledging the idea that, we're positioned or the project is out of Harvard. And so thinking about that and what does that legacy and those relationships, what are some of, the ongoing injustices or the resources distribution and how those might look different, I think it's something that we're always thinking about and being in conversation with ourselves and thinking about like, what does an authentic partnership look like? What does support look like? As a digital project, it might, when I explain it to my family or to my mom, it sounds easy. Like, you ask someone to digitize something, you get it and you just make it available, right? But as information professionals, we know that there's a lot of things undergirding that. One person might digitize something to X specs and might use, I only have a flatbed scanner at their dissemination. Another person might be using a Zoichel or a book scanner. So there's all these different specifications and this actual real labor that needs to happen to make these things available that we're accounting for. And then lastly, I would say there's many things, but the big one that we're trying to work our ways around now is infrastructure. The idea that this project is associated with Harvard Graduate School of Education and thinking about Harvard Library has its own ecosystem of library practices with nearly 70 libraries and trying to figure out, okay, how do we honor the accessibility needs, thinking about this project and how do we think about the longevity of the project within the Harvard ecosystem. Currently, right now, we're thinking through something as important as full text search and working within the Harvard infrastructure to make sure that that is something that is there before we, make this material accessible, knowing that most people who would see this corpus of, nearly 600 journals are able to look across and do a full text search. So there's these conversations that we're having, externally with our partners, thinking about getting the material ready and sending it and thinking about, the different considerations and concerns there, but also thinking about internally, how are our structures set up? What kind of vendors do we need to contract so that this material is honored in its best possible way?
Awesome. You also mentioned, and I don't want to take up anybody else's time with any questions, but you mentioned about not necessarily having Harvard at the forefront within the branding of the Black Teacher Archive. How do you think that you all will be able to overcome those limitations of anyone who may think that this is a strictly Harvard project and collection?
Yeah. Well, first, I guess I always lean into that because I guess any possibilities of distrust or they're not unwarranted. And so I think even as information professionals, what someone thinks of an institution and the harm that an institution might cause or the troubled history that it might cause, the relationship, I think is important to acknowledge. It's not personal when, I might reach out to folks, I might not get a response back. It's a manifest of many different things. It could be that they're busy. It could be that they're weary. So I think honestly, having conversations about that and naming it is critical to any work that seeks to be reparative or is, critically thinking about the context in which any labor is being conducted nowadays in our information science. So, we're working through that. It's been very interesting, even for me as someone who's worked as an archivist, who's worked with tools, but I actually am realizing that there's a whole digital library sphere of information of like what is the undergirding infrastructure, and thinking about like what are ways that we can circumvent things, what are things that we can highlight, what are things that we can downplay. But I think for us in this project, we're really using Harvard's resources to think about the long-term preservation and the care. The organizing from the project is coming out of that space, but we're looking forward to developing something that is actually branded towards the Black Teacher Archive, and thinking about this as a body and legacy of, organizations that are actually not in existence now, but should still be remembered on their own.
Yeah, I actually worked at the South Caroliniana Library at the University of
Yes.
South Carolina in graduate school, and I came across those pamphlets in my work there. And it's good to see it coming full circle, and also see an opportunity for broadening access to those. So as a resource, so that is wonderful. We do have a comment from Aaron. Aaron, I'm not sure if you want to come on to elaborate on your comment or not.
Sure. Oh, I can
Okay.
just read it out loud as well. It really was not a question necessarily, but it was more of a comment. And sorry, I'm having connectivity issues, so I have to keep my camera off. But it's more of a comment saying that I hope that this project is shared in education programs all over. For those who don't know, while I'm a librarian archivist, actually, I initially went into the education program to be a secondary education teacher. And it was there where I found the love of archives and archival work. But one thing that I think I would have loved to have learned is about a project like this, and especially as a teacher, but also being from New York and being from a multicultural and ethnic, neighborhood and community, something like this would have been a welcomed and invited resource, right? But in any event, I was just saying that I thought that this is really just a wonderful project, and thank you for sharing your experiences, and something that I know will continue to inspire future education and information professionals.
And I second that comment. I think, like I said before, I think there's a wealth of research to be done, especially once this is all accessible to people. And I can only imagine all the projects that will grow out of this. So this is phenomenal. If we don't have any other questions, does anyone? I will ask again if anyone has any questions or comments, because we do have a few more minutes. But in the meantime, I do want to thank you, Micha, for serving as our closing keynote speaker. This was an awesome way to close out our conference this year. I have just been touched by all of the sessions today. I've learned so much, and there's just been just so many connections throughout this, as far as so many common threads that everyone has been sharing within their work. So I'm feeling inspired, and I hope that others are feeling the same way. And I'm definitely inspired by this project as well. We do have a comment from Anne Merriman, and she says, "Thank you for sharing this wonderful work with all of us. We appreciate the time you took to share with us." And I second that as well. We really do, and we do not take it for granted for you taking your time today and presenting with us. We really appreciate it. So I guess we may wrap up a little early today, but now we will lead into our closing comments. But is there anything else that you would like to share with us, Micha, before we conclude?
No, you all have been wonderful. I really appreciate both you and Aaron. So I just want to say thank you again. We're continuing to navigate this pandemic, but it is wonderful to be in community and have new possibilities of connection and thinking through new possibilities of presenting and sharing information. So I thank you all for your time today. And I apologize for messing up University of South Carolina earlier. It is
Oh,
still
no.
sticking with me. But much love to my friends over there. And I wish you all well. Thank you.
Thank you. And we thank you for presenting. Aaron, would you like to also chime in? I guess now we're going to close out everything with our remarks. I, for one, want to thank you all. We do have one comment. I'm sorry. Bill has left a comment. He had 2 African-American teachers who were the most caring people who greatly impacted his life. So just another testament to how important this project is. But in terms of our closing remarks, I do want to thank you all for attending. This conference has been an exciting one for me, and I hope you all have learned a lot and have been inspired as much as I have been with all the sessions today. But I thank you all for attending. I want to give special thanks to our keynote speakers, to Jermaine Fowler in his absence, as well as to Micha, and for taking their time out to preparing the presentations, because I know that in and of itself takes time, and then also presenting before us and sharing their projects and insight. We really appreciate it. And I want to also extend my thanks to our board for helping us behind the scenes today, and also for giving us some input along the way with the planning of this conference. Erin, was there anything else that you would like to add?
No, just thank you to all of our presenters, all of our attendees. Tabitha, you touched on pretty much everything I can share.
Okay.
It's been a long day too, but Micha and
Yes.
Jermaine, our keynotes, wonderful job. And to all of our presenters, I'm walking away today so inspired, albeit, staring at the computer screen a little too long, but for good reason and good measure. And I just look forward to bringing new ideas that I've learned, that I've gotten from all of our presenters today, back to my own community next week. So I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend, a wonderful remainder of the year. Be well,
Yes.
take care of yourselves, take care of others, be kind, and thank you again. And Tabitha, you're a rock star. And thanks
Thank you.
again.
So are you, Erin. And thank you all for attending, and have a wonderful weekend and enjoy the gift of time. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you so much, y'all.